So Layla M, very simple premise, but I thought really, really well executed, and I can really recommend this movie. I think it's great. So the premise, there's a young Muslim girl originally from Morocco. She's in Amsterdam, and you just see her increasing radicalization, becoming more and more devout in her Muslim beliefs, eventually falling in love with a budding jihadist, and they move around a bit, eventually settle in the Middle East in a very conservative community. And I'll leave it from there, but not too much more happens. Very simple plot, but I think really well executed. And one of the reasons is oftentimes in these debates we have about immigration, about Islam, the burka ban, stuff like that, they're often very abstract, very logical. Here they really ground it in relatable characters. And right from the start, a few little things they do, you immediately identify with Layla, the protagonist, a lot. And her whole journey, you're able to some extent, take a first-person view and really feel empathy with her, compassion throughout all the things we go through, and it gives you, I feel like, such a different perspective than a lot of people normally have when they're talking about these issues. And what I really like about this is you realize that for some of these mind-boggling questions, like why do some women join ISIS, become such adamant radicals for ISIS, when the whole ideology of ISIS apparently is so anti-woman? In some ways it's these specific cultural factors, but sometimes it's some of the most basic human universals fundamental to all of us. So why does she fall in love with this young jihadist? Well, it's just basic attraction, and it's the same reason why everyone falls in love with people that are really bad for them. Obviously there's some cultural specific factors, but at a root level it's always the same. It's rebellion against parents, it's idealism, it's having a disconnect between your image of someone and what the reality is, your image of an ideology and what the actual reality would be. It's arrogance and overconfidence. And I love how I think her big downfall and what kind of led to her downfall, again, you get to spoilers. I don't know whether you could consider it downfall or not, but what led her down the path was, I think, overconfidence, where she was such a strong, independent, smart, witty, powerful person, and growing up in the West, where she faced some oppression, but for a large part, she was able to bully people and talk down to people, whether it was her friends, her family, even the police. She had such a position of power. She had a kind of hubris where she could never really see herself getting herself in a situation she couldn't get out of and really being oppressed. She was just had such an inflated view of her own power that when she was actually put in a situation where it didn't matter how strong she was, it didn't matter how clever she was, she just couldn't fight against the society and the culture around her. She was honestly probably pretty shocked. And I love the early scene we get. One of the first scenes we see of her is she's really arguing about a call in a soccer match. The ref was being unfair to her team, or at least she perceived it that way. And immediately you start to see, how are you going to perceive that? What conclusion are you going to draw? Either you can draw the conclusion that, well, she's just deep down so obsessed with justice and fairness, and any kind of injustice, however small, just outrages her, and that's what led her down this path. Or you can see it as, well, she's just very combative and she likes to fight, and she's aggressive to some extent, and maybe even violent to some extent. She has a love for violence and conflict. So immediately you start to get her characterization, and different people are going to perceive it in different ways. And one thing I thought was really interesting, especially early scenes where she's with her parents at the dinner table and getting into these heated arguments, she reminded me so much of kind of your image of what young people during the 60s, particularly very aggressive people who were very aggressively against the Vietnam War and were the kind of rebels, and eventually the extreme of that is Weather Underground and bombing. She reminded me so much of that. And I guess a few major differences. One is in the 60s with the Weather Underground, the end result of that is criminality and actually perpetrating bombings. The end result of her radicalization is to some extent her own oppression. So slight difference there, and I'll get more into the whole paradox of female fanaticism within these movements. And another difference I would say is with her, there was kind of a nationalist, a kind of, you wouldn't say racism, you would say, I think, bigotry and tribalism and in-group identification, where, you know, if you look at the 60s with the people against the Vietnam War, the people they were saying they cared about the most were Vietnamese. They weren't Americans, they weren't white, so there was a kind of global universalist perspective. Here, the people she cared about, it wasn't poor people, it wasn't just generalized people, no, it was people from Syria, and there's, a reason she cared about those people. So slightly different, but I think it's interesting to think deep down at their fundamental essence, are they the same? Do they have the same drives, the same black and white morality view, the same drive for justice, and the same by any means necessary, or deep down you scratch, and at essence, her and someone from the 60s who's a Vietnam War protester, deep down are they actually the same, even though because of where they've been born, how they've happened to be raised, their end results are going to be so different. And then you get to the classic question of, does her being a victim exclude all the awful things she does and enables, and all the other and the awful things she encourages and promotes? So with the example of someone from the 60s, the Weather Underground, not a lot of people have too much sympathy for them. They might praise their idealism and their conviction, but they're going to come down very harshly on their actions. With Layla, people might praise her conviction and idealism, but they might go further and say, look, well, since she experienced some minor oppression originally in her home country and then experienced extreme oppression later in her life, that kind of excuses everything bad she's done, and she kind of goes from perpetrator to victim. Or other people might say, well, no, she's both. She's a perpetrator and a victim, and those two things can exist in parallel. And Layla would be one example for an interesting phenomenon of women being fanatics for causes where at least a large segment of their cause they're fighting for believes that they shouldn't have the right to be vocal even in supporting their cause. And there's a mix. There's some people who would say they shouldn't be allowed to be vocal even in defense of their cause, even during the early stages. There's others who take a more pragmatic approach who say, well, look, ideally, once we achieve our victory, then women like that, they won't be vocal. But right now, we need all the help we can get. So we should tolerate them being supportive of our cause. We should take what we can get from them. But, later down the line, that'll stop. And we start to see the paradox within this movie where she clearly doesn't seem to respect or definitely not obey her father. And most religions, including Islam, teach respect and obedience to some extent to your parents. So how does she rationalize that? I guess she would rationalize it and say, well, my father, he's not a true Muslim because he's not really down with the cause. He's not really practicing his faith. So that's how she would rationalize it. But you start to get these interesting questions. They have a really interesting debate at the dinner table where, she takes a fundamentalist literalist approach, and he says, well, look, you can't just cherry pick quotes. You got to look at them within the context of the whole holy book, and also within the societal context, I assume he'd say. And we also see, it's interesting where we see domestic abuse, how sometimes it can be culturally affected, where we see the domestic abuse we see, it's not always the person committing it. It's not just that he hates his spouse and wants to do it, but he feels embarrassed, and he feels that if he doesn't, it's going to look badly on him. So it's a great example of how a culture of toxicity can lead to individuals feeling compelled to do something that they might not otherwise do. And I think this movie really, it gets to the heart of, you call it the burka debate, but I think it's a more general split between people, but particularly liberals. And there's choice liberals who seem to believe that if people choose something, that's by definition good. And choice and having people be free to follow their choices and live the lives that they choose to live, that is by definition good. And as liberals, a lot of believe that, and also libertarians to an extent believe that. I wouldn't say to an extent, say libertarians, that's their highest, almost one of their highest principles. And then there's other people who say there's things that are objectively good and objectively bad, and it doesn't matter how many people choose them or whether they choose them or not. And oftentimes choices are really influenced by your upbringing, by conservatism, by the past, by traditions, by marketing, by people who want to get profit off your desires. So they would say oftentimes choices, they're not really free, and the idea of free choice, to some extent, it's a myth. And if you look within feminism, second wave feminism, it was all about saying things are inherently harmful to women. Pornography, prostitution, these things are just inherently harmful, and we need to ban them and eliminate them. And then we get third wave feminism, which takes a complete opposite stance and puts a very high premium on choice and says, well, prostitution, it can be good, it can be bad. It depends on society and cultural factors and whether the industry has regulations and things like that. And then is the woman choosing to go into that industry? So a pretty big split, and decisively has been won by third wave feminists, but there's still second wave feminists out there who believe the opposite. And then you look at liberals, there's some liberals who would, deep down, they probably believe that if the people genuinely voted in a government that was very repressive of their rights, but the people genuinely had the freedom to vote, and deep down in their heart they voted in this government, they would say, well, who am I to say that that's not liberal? Like, fundamentally, the liberalism is about people being able to choose and have the right to choose their destiny. But I think I think how most liberals would say, well, I guess hypothetically that would be true, but deep down people are good people, and they would never authentically vote in a government that was so repressive. So I think that's how they kind of square that circle. And then there's other people who say it doesn't matter what people deep down choose. There's liberal principles and ideals that, regardless of how popular they are or how much people choose them, they should be fought over. So, anyways, I think there's a conflict between people who hold up choice as very important, and there's people who they say, well, choice is important, but again, it's very complex, and a lot of things factor and influence people's choices. So, anyways, really good movie. I think definitely worth a watch. I hope it gets traction. It's coming out on Netflix soon, so I hope a lot of people watch it.